And we're also trying to make sure that we can have a community, whether you put on a uniform or not, or join the contractor base. How can we address emerging threats, eliminate potential strategic surprise, and build a driven, successful, vibrant community of space professionals? So I don't think anything can frame the importance of this issue other than the keynote speakers that we have here to kick this off today. So we'll begin with Major General Shawn Bratton. He is the first commander of the Space Force's Space Training and Readiness Command, STARCOM. And then that'll be followed by remarks from Mr. Chirag Parikh. He's the Executive Secretary of the National Space Council. And this will be followed by as much time as we have for Q&A. And I may go just a little rogue and just pull people out of the audience for your questions as well, because that's how I roll. So with that, we will start with Major General Shawn Bratton, first commander of STARCOM, currently located at Peterson. So STARCOM was established in August of 2021, so still new, and is responsible for preparing the Space Force's more than 6,000 Guardians to prevail in competition and conflict through innovative education, training, doctrine, and test. So he received his commission from the Academy of Military Science. There's a reason why I'm giving some of this, not just to stall. But prior to his commissioning, he was an enlisted member with the Arizona Air National Guard, numerous positions. He was the first National Guardsman to attend the Space Weapons Instructor course, and then also deployed to Iraq as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom. He led a cyber operations group, and then also served as the Deputy Director of Operations for U.S. Space Command. So I could think of nobody better with the perspectives of all facets of the total force to be the first commander of STARCOM. And sir, the floor is yours.
Hey, so thanks. This room is really oddly long, so I'm gonna like pay attention to these guys and ignore all of you guys. I'm thrilled to be here. We have been working hard, and we talk a lot about this very issue at STARCOM between Chief Sabias, who you'll hear from a little bit later, and I and the whole force, and how to get our arms around it. We're building a brand new thing from scratch. Our STARCOM had our 1-year anniversary. We're until recently we were the newest thing in the Space Force, and then SDA just came over, and now they're the new, and we're like the old head now, being 1 year old. It's pretty incredible and exciting time, and I'll tell you, I'll start with a story that wasn't a Space Force mission, but something that happened last week that probably many of you watched, I hope, on NASA TV, was the DART mission. Chief and I got to go up to APL and witness that amazing event. And in case you're not tracking, NASA intentionally smashed a spacecraft into an asteroid. And for the first time in the history of ever, moved a celestial body in the solar system by doing that. And it was a planetary defense mission. The intent is, hey, if one of those is ever coming at us, we got to have something in the bank. And so it was a test. See how they do it. It was very successful. And we got to sit in kind of they had an ops floor out there, and we're sitting in sort of the owner's box, right, glass walled, so we didn't interfere. I'm sitting next to Bill Nye, by the way, which was a highlight of my life, and my credibility with my kids went way up. But we got to witness this amazing feat, and you've all seen the pictures of this. What happens when they have mission success at NASA or JPL or APL? They all jump up and cheer, all these engineers, and they're just beside themselves with excitement. And the culture, right? The culture that leads to that we just did something incredibly difficult that probably no one else in the world is capable of doing. And we, the team, in this case, APL and NASA team, accomplished something that others can't do, and that sense of excitement and determination to solve hard problems is evident when they all, start hugging each other and throw their hands in the air. And we're right there with them, not even on that team, and I'm just filled with excitement about what they did. And what goes through my mind is, how do we engender that in the Space Force? I want them standing up and cheering when we have successes and celebrating those victories. And so we think about it all the time, and how do we inculcate that culture into the service? I was going to talk a little bit about, as we onboard, so STARCOM, in case you don't know, responsible for all training and education for the Space Force. We also do operational tests. And so we test new systems as they come on board, and a couple other things. But those are the big ticket items. And so when someone first joins the Space Force, they start, in our house with STARCOM. And so that first entry into the service, and how do we onboard them, is done through Delta One, and a lot of help from the Air Force right now. We're still very much wedded to the Air Force in a lot of these areas. But that front line, that first phase out in the recruiters, is how do we get the right people into the force? we're tiny. The Space Force is tiny compared to the other services. 18,000 people, just over when we're fully grown. About half of that is civilian, so about 9,000 military members. It's a tiny amount. We only assess about 500 enlisted a year, 300 officers. Just for comparison, the Army brings in 120,000 enlisted members every year. We're bringing in 500. It's great because we don't really have the recruiting challenge. We don't got to go get those big numbers. And there's more people that want to join the Space Force really than we have spaces for. At least today, that's true. And so it's how do we find the right member that we're a good fit for them and they're a good fit for us. And so that goes right to sort of this discussion that we're going to have today. Once we bring them into the force, then how do we build them over time? How do we keep, and that goes to retention a little bit, but really how do we make them better in order to make us better as part of the team so that we can accomplish our military mission? Because at the end of the day, that is absolutely what it's all about for the Space Force. But building members through training and education, through opportunities that makes them better, that contributes to the team, that makes the Space Force stronger and better to execute the mission. And we think about that in advanced training and opportunities for degrees, potentially for the enlisted force, and professional military education. We're just on the edge of announcing our new PME program we're really excited about. And that should come out in a couple of weeks. So stand by for that. But we're working hard on those things, on how do we develop a Guardian over time, whether military or civilian, over time, partly because we want to keep them in the force, for sure, but mainly because we want to make them better, to make us better, to do the mission better. And then that employment piece, it's real important. We can develop and build and make them smarter, but if we're not using them correctly, if we don't put those tools to work, the force gets disenfranchised. Hey, you taught me things that I don't get to do. And that's a little bit, we talk about it in say-do differences and things like that, but that's a little bit, I think we're struggling a little bit with that now. Like we're offering, there's so much opportunity in the Space Force, but who has what opportunity is what we're working through. Not everyone is going to go do everything. And the needs of the service have to come first. That's why the service exists. And so balancing that and then communicating it clearly to the force is critical. And we're thinking through how to do that now, and how do we give enough opportunity to develop and enhance and give the member, self-satisfaction and actualization and all those things that we want, but only or primarily when it makes the force better, stronger, faster for us to do the mission. And we're working through that. And I think that's going to take us some time to get to. Right now, we're filled with excitement and ideas. Not all those ideas are going to turn out to be good. And identifying which ones and implementing and hanging on to them, not being afraid to cast off the old stuff will be real important. We had a chance, we took the STARCOM team down to Houston to see NASA, because we're talking a lot about training and education. We're like, they've been going to space for a long time. Let's go see how they do it. And we're really interested in simulation and use of simulation and how they did that in training. But we had the great privilege to hear from Gene Kranz came and talked to us. And I'm sure you all know, so go watch Apollo 13, We're the Best, flight director, right? Goes by flight the whole time. And he was big in the Apollo, primarily in Apollo and then a little bit the early shuttle days. But he came and talked to us and he ran the show. And Gene said, and he talked a lot about engineers. He said, hey, we had all engineers, which was great because they know how to solve very, very difficult problems. But he said we had to take the engineers and turn them into operators because they'd never been in this situation. They don't understand the implications always of their engineering solution. And so the best combination you can have is a team comprised of both. Or what NASA does is take engineers and make them operators. But having all of those skill sets, not just all of one or all the other. They had an incredible technical support, right? The biggest and best machines that NASA could build were all available to the flight team at NASA in the Apollo days and in the shuttle days for sure. But he said in the end it came down to, is the team determined to succeed? They overcame insurmountable problems, and again, the Apollo 13 movie is a great demonstration of that. None of those got solved with technology. They all got solved because the team was determined to succeed. And I'll go right back to standing on the floor last week watching the DART team smash the spacecraft into the asteroid. Incredibly hard technical problem, incredible challenges along the way, but the determination of the team and that culture that they built, in that case at APL or for Gene Kranz at NASA, is I want some of that for the Space Force. How do I engender that for the Space Force? And so we think about it. I'm happy to talk about it a little bit more and answer questions. But really, I'm looking forward. I looked at all the panels, and even though I work with some of these folks, I'm really excited to hear kind of the thoughts and the thinking, and really from the NSSA and KPMG crowd, what should we be doing? What are your good ideas? And we've had the chance to work with many of you, and we're bringing that in. But I'm excited to be here today. Thanks so much for the opportunity, and look forward to the discussion. Yeah, thanks.
Next up, our other keynote speaker of the afternoon, we have Mr. Chirag Parikh. He is a space policy veteran. So an aerospace engineer, he started his work at NASIC out in Ohio, and then NAIC, I'm sorry, it wasn't a space thing, even better. And then went over to DNI, and then he was within the White House as the director of space policy for the National Security Council, NGA, and went to Microsoft before he was called back to government service to be the executive secretary of the National Space Council just a couple of years ago. So we're honored to have him here joining us today, but I think we all know the greatest impact that he has had on the space community is as the founding organizer of Spaceball, which is a great event here in DC. I think it just symbolizes, it embraces our community's crazy, nerdy camaraderie. And for that, I know we all have a great debt of gratitude to you. And sir, the floor is yours.
Okay, you guys can hear me? Okay, got it. You know, this is kind of first of all, it's a crazy room. So usually I feel like I should be at one end or the other and looking down into the abyss here. So Mandy, thanks again for the introduction, and thanks to NSSA for the opportunity to speak here. This is not usually a venue that, it's not a venue that gets a lot of notoriety and attention, and particularly on the national security side of things, workforce, STEM education. Boy, there's a dearth of these types of conversations. So this is really important that we have this conversation here and now. The reason I thought it was very important for Space Council to speak here is because it aligns very much in the priorities of what we're working on right now. I also say I like to look across the room usually when I speak, and I feel like this is a 180-degree pan. Sorry, we'll go straight into anecdotes here. So when I worked at NGA, Robert Cardillo used to say, an analyst, please don't quote me on this, but he used to say an analyst, their field of view is 7 degrees to the left and 7 degrees right. And if you force them to go to a different network or a different computer, good luck with that. So and now this is like 180 degrees. So this is very strange. But I think it's very interesting to have this conversation here and now, because we think about, you'll hear so much about you've already heard so much about the Space Force and the workforce here. But the vast majority of you guys represent truly the vast majority of the space industry that supports national security, and that's the space industry. And the fact is that you don't just represent the national security space industry often, you represent the space industry often. And what's good for a national security space launch is good for DART, is good for a commercial SATCOM going into space, and some of the similar technologies. And it just so happens it's some of the same people as well. And one of the things from a Space Council perspective that we're truly focused on is how are we the tide that rises the sea, or how do we rise all ships? And it is a daunting challenge right now. I would say right now, when you think about it, we'll do a little history lesson. Does anybody know what last week was as an anniversary? I actually spoke about a little bit of workforce last week. It happened to be on the day, so it was a little bit more dramatic for effect. But last week was the 65th anniversary of Sputnik. Think about where our nation was then. Think about where we were thinking about, like, gosh, we need to organize differently, we need to train differently, we need to think differently, we need to educate differently as well. And you think about it, right, if we want to use movie quotes or movie references, you referenced Apollo 13, another great space movie. If you guys have seen it, it's referenced off of a book from Homer Hickam, October Sky, right? And how the nation, in almost literally a moment, even though there was warning, in a moment changed its entire aperture because of that, dot that was silently going through the night sky and terrified. And think about it, until then, Americans, we really felt protected by our technology. And now all of a sudden, everybody knew what the implication of that dot going over their heads was. It was not, oh, it's the dawn of the space age. It was not that at all, of course, right? It was about strategic conflict. It was about nuclear war. And the interesting thing about that, I think, unlike now, is it permeated every household. It permeated every, societal conversation, every proverbial, I'm not sure if there were water coolers back then, but water cooler type conversations. Does that, I throw this as a question, we can have this as a conversation. Does the importance of national security space permeate households right now? I see you shaking your head right now. You've already given away the answer. Right. But do people realize and recognize the importance of space? And I'll give you the center square bingo. I'll give you GPS. Then what? And I think the answer is we must, because whether it's reconnaissance, whether it's SATCOM, even your cable, believe it or not. I mean, you think Fios is all fiber. It's just the last mile. Or Xfinity, sorry to be picking one or the other there, right? But, I think the Sputnik launch really was a rise of the space age. Not the dawn of the space age, right? We've been thinking about that for a very long time here. But I think you got to think about this from the historical context before we think about it going forward. What happened? We'll do another Q&A. What happened because of Sputnik? NASA, that's one.
The National Defense Education Act.
Oh, that was going to be my zing. Okay, yeah. So, all right, she's already given away the punchline. There are two things that often people, unlike Mandy, will often talk about because of Sputnik. Number one, absolutely NASA. Number two, DARPA. DARPA was created in response to Sputnik. Those are two significant organizational changes that were because of global events that were happening. But I think, and that was the year after Sputnik, not, I feel horrible. One was, 3 years ago, so 2019. So it's not 18 years after the Rumsfeld Commission. It was a year after Sputnik, right? And what happened is the third thing, which Mandy already alluded to, which I think it's underreported, underappreciated, but must be noticed. And that's the National Defense Education Act was passed by Congress and signed by President Eisenhower. And there's a lot of stats, there's a lot of stories and anecdotes you can look up online about the NDEA. I'll give you one. It provided federal funding for student loans. There was a debate on Congress whether it was going to be loans or grants. It ended up becoming loans for people to get college educations because there was a perception that the United States was lagging the Soviet Union in the space race, and our national educational system was not producing enough scientists and engineers. And so what happened, in a period of a decade, we went from about 3.6 million students in undergraduate education to 7.5 million students because of the National Defense Education Act. And that was a national galvanizing moment of things that were happening along the way. And of course, yada, 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 the rest is history, so to speak here. So where are we in the current context of things? Again, in this room, we know what space provides to us, right? It provides us connectivity, it provides us navigation, it provides us warning, right? We also understand the importance that space provides, as I alluded to earlier, about commercial, your day-to-day lives, the commercial utilization of space, the innovation of space, but it's also recognizing the importance that space provides to our economy and to skilled workforce and to, developing a new workforce altogether with respect to STEM-related career fields as well. But we understand the value that space has for warfighting. Yes, one area of my life. By the way, I love that you said that I'm a veteran space policy person, because for the longest time I was a veteran space intelligence person, so I flipped. So, but we used to write the intelligence estimates and such, as some of you know, on the threats to our space systems. And believe it or not, it didn't happen when, we didn't all of a sudden find out, oh my gosh, the Chinese blew up a satellite. There was some warning. It wasn't like, oh my gosh, the Russians just blew up a satellite. There was some warning. And it's one of these things where we now know the current environment that we're in. We know our adversaries are trying to deny us the use of space. We also know that our adversaries understand the important value of space. And it's not just military perspective as well. It's also for foreign policy. It's also for their it's also for their diplomacy and also for their economic and job growth as well. I don't have the statistics. Maybe somebody in here does, but the amount of STEM graduates that China is pushing out is staggering, comparatively speaking, to the United States and the world as well. And I would say that's over a longer period of time why Space Force and Space Command have come to bear. And that's fantastic. And so many people from the Rumsfeld Commission all the way through now should take credit for, I think, the great work. And so now we've got the organizational structure for this. What do we do about this? One of the things that I want to highlight, of course, and it's no disrespect to all of our, particularly Air Force members here, but a lot of our, or former Air Force members, is the culture, and this is not a question for me to answer, this is truly a question for the uniformed service to answer, which is, you've come from an entire career of Air Force culture. And now you have a lot of junior people coming in. How do you pivot so quickly on some? And I think some of your comments are dead on, right? Like we're going to have to think differently about how we develop these kind of capabilities, how we develop this type of workforce here. The other problem is of course, there's not a problem. The other issue is commercial space is out there now. You don't have to go work for NASA. You don't have to go work for the Department of Defense or the intelligence community to do space anymore. So now it's a hyper-competitive field. And there aren't a lot of people who will go from the private sector back to the government. So at least I know one. It was a hard one. It was a hard deal to say no to, right? So, but I think it's a very competitive market. The good news is it's a growing market, and so there's opportunity to be able to go back and forth along the way. I think when we think about the protect and defend mission of the Department of Defense and with respect to space, we also need to think about the fact of, look, there's so much attention placed on the threats to our space systems. Got it. But we should equivalently, it's not in lieu, but in addition, we should be focused on the mission that makes space in the Department of Defense great as well, which is the support of the joint fight. I think that gets lost in a lot of narrative because there's a desire to push, the importance of the space systems, and that's a very dramatic way of showing that. But let's not forget about the navigation, the communications, and the warning that space systems provide us as well. When it gets to the actual type of people, what are you looking at? It's a typical mission sets. How do you acquire? Now, back in the day, you acquire through your traditional defense industrial base. Now you have this changed environment, unlike back in the Cold War, of where you have all these new space capabilities. That's number one. Number two, from an international perspective, a couple elements. One, they're developing their own capabilities. They're developing their own workforce. How do we partner, not just with capabilities, but how do we partner with people? And I don't mean just people as in like, let's talk about co-developing something, but how do you do personnel exchanges? The intelligence community, of course, often goes through, the Five Eye type of fora. But as we see things that are happening with the Department of Defense through CSPO and other efforts now, being able to bring in other allies and partners who realize the value and power of space, not just of what we provide them, but also the capabilities that they're providing. The other element is operations. We got to think completely differently about how operations are now as well. Operations in a contested domain in space, an operations in a denied environment if you don't have the capabilities, operations for a proliferated LEO architecture in a debris laden low Earth orbit environment. How do you operate on these types of conditions here? What type of training do you need to have people to do that? What kind of warning do they need? There's two other ones too. I think, acquisition, operations. The third obvious one is policy and strategy. What are the thresholds in how we operate? Who do we partner with? When do we partner with them? When do we operate? When do we? There's a lot of TTMP that needs to be considered, tactics, techniques, and procedures along the way. And there's a lot of strategies, and you have to take into account commercial. You need, and the reason I'm bringing these up it's not because those are the buckets, but these are the buckets that people need to fill. And we need to be able to train them and think about them in a different way than maybe we did in other environments. Maybe the answer is there's lessons learned from the Air Force, all right, in air operations. Maybe the answer is actually naval operations, where you have a submarine underwater, right, which is disconnected from everything, and you have to basically automate and operate within a disconnected environment. How do you bring some of those capabilities? But I'll tell you there's a fourth one. So we have operations, acquisition, policy and strategy. There's a fourth one that I think is not well reflected here, and it's communications. And I don't mean communications as in battlefield communications. What's your story? It sounds almost facade-ish in a sense, but like, what's the story that we're trying to articulate from a national security space perspective? And I say national security space, I'm not talking Department of Defense or intelligence community. I'm talking writ large. You can even bring in the commercial element that supports that as well. And who are you talking to? What are we telling our international partners? What are you telling to your cadre as well? What are you telling to your sister agencies, sister services, or sister departments and agencies? And then to people like me and on Congress, what are you telling your oversight? Well, this is a great time of year for me. It's my favorite time of year. It's budget season. Budgets are dropping on our desks. We're evaluating them. Working with departments and agencies across the board: NASA, NOAA, USGS, DoD, IC, and so on and so forth. What's the story? And it's because the threat, Chirag. Okay, what's the story? And I think the story is there, and it's helpful for me because I've come from this community and I understand it. But you have to understand that leadership changes, personnel changes, expertise changes. And do you know who your audience is when you're talking to them? Because I think we all know the story. But do we have an articulate story to talk to people who don't know this? Go talk to your mom. Go talk to your wife. Go talk to your husband. Tell them the story. If they don't get it, then maybe somebody else might not get it as well. And I think that is a career field, in my opinion, being able to put together that story. And I just don't know if we value that enough. I don't know if we appreciate it enough, because I think we assume it often. And so it's just something to think about. Let me finish on a few things about what we're doing from a Space Council perspective, just so you guys have a feel, the bigger picture perspective of what's going on. Vice President Harris, of course, is the chair of the Space Council. She has, on multiple occasions, already had the opportunity to meet with multiple guardians, both enlisted as well as officer. We are honored and privileged to have Brigadier General Select Jake Middleton be on our staff as the Director of National Space Policy on the Space Council as well. So you can blame him for any bad things I say, and I definitely take credit for all the good things I say. So thank you, Jake, for that. But I would say there's a few things. Last September, we had our Space Council meeting, and it was a culmination of work, and I call it, it went right down to the finish line. And we released several different things along the way. And this is in reflection to some of the guidance and policy that we received from the Vice President. Some of the guidance that we received, and that we released last year, was we need to invest in our STEM workforce. We need to have an ecosystem of public and private organizations to help educate our students. And we need to have a diverse and multicultural workforce as well. And our space industry is like many other industries, and we just need to do better. And we're trying to do what we can on that part. So some of the things that we released, this isn't actually Space Council related, but I want to reflect back on the NDEA that Mandy talked about, is the CHIPS and Science Act. Many may not be focused on it because it didn't say space directly in there. And I think that's one of the things that we as an industry need to reflect upon. We don't need to build it ourselves. Maybe there's areas where we can leverage some of these things. So for instance, in the CHIPS and Science Act, they actually have workforce development authorizations in areas like quantum, cybersecurity, advanced manufacturing, microelectronics. Last I checked, all of which are important to the space industry. So how can the space industry, how can departments and agencies leverage the CHIPS and Science Act to build the workforce that enables those capacities to be able to enable our space industry in the long run there? It also emphasizes both 4-year and 2-year degrees to include like community colleges and even MSIs as well. So a couple of things that we released last September that you should all read, because we're looking for your input, we're looking for your partnership here. And I'm talking about departments and agencies, government entities, as well as industry here. We released an interagency roadmap to support space-related STEM education and workforce. you'll see every department and agency listed in there: DoD, IC, DHS, Energy, NASA, NOAA, you name them. They're all part of this. The other thing, part of this thing that I think is really, really interesting is we're not just focused on the STEM workforce anymore. It's still always important. I understand that. But we're also making sure that we put additional spotlight on the skilled technical workforce as well. Welders, machinists, robotic engineers, you name electricians. You think about the Artemis program that'll hopefully launch next month. Tens of thousands of people helped build the Artemis 1 program. When you think about Artemis 1, you think about the SLS rocket, you think about the Orion capsule. But guys, the mobile launcher is part of something. Somebody had to build that. Somebody had to recreate architecture and apparatus within the vehicle assembly building. So much of this stuff gets underappreciated, underwhelmed, or unnoticed. And so that's one thing. I would also say federal agencies, and particularly I'd like to put a shout out to Space Force, have rolled out several things as well. Space Force announced the fact that they want to have another, I think it's the 14th now, university partnership program with the University of Puerto Rico. And in order to build the next generation of space guardians, these types of commitments are really important. You said it. You have more people who want to be in the Space Force than you have room for Space Force now. Like, what a great problem to have, right? Like people just, I met somebody maybe a couple months ago. They don't know what the Space Force did, but they just said it sounds cool. So I want to go work in the Space Force. So, hey, if you got the skills and we're able to develop you, why not, right? So, but there's also probably like 2 or 3 pages of private sector commitment to this. And I think that's one of the things that I want to make sure that everybody is aware of, is this is something that we can't do alone. This is something that we have to do with our private sector directly here. Last thing I'll say here is kind of going back to the end, or back to the beginning here. In our work roadmap, we're not just focused on the students. We're also focused on the educational institutions. We're also focused on the educators. Without the educators, we don't get the students and the people that we need to hire. Without the people, we don't get the programs that we need to operate, develop policies and tactics around as well. So we're really looking down to the most fundamental element here to be able to build up the workforce here. So I probably blown my time as always, Mandy, so I apologize in advance, but look forward to talking to you guys. Thank you for your attention.
So you brought up a whole variety of roadmap and interagency areas. Thank you. And that can result in policy changes that can address this kind of across the ecosystem. What would be kind of your target list? What are kind of the policy priorities that the National Space Council is looking at now? Kind of what's your wish list? And then for you, what are your priorities for you to be able to inculcate this warfighter ethos specifically for the Space Force?
Let me start.
Sure.
Yeah, so I think I would bucket it into 3 different areas here, because not one size fits all to be able to build the space workforce of the future. You have to focus on one is what I talked about earlier, which is the educators and the K through 12. The vast majority of us know the fact that most people who enter the STEM workforce are inspired to be in STEM somewhere in about the 3rd to 7th, 8th grade timeframe. So we really need to figure out how do you get the word out that there are all these space careers? Go to anybody. What's a space job? First thing they say is an astronaut, right? But all these other jobs, right? You get to be a warfighter, you get to be an operator, you get to be policy, you get to be a space diplomat if you want, right? Like there's this variety of jobs. And so one of the things that we've done in partnership with the Department of Defense and other interagency partners is develop a space careers website so people can actually go on and go, oh, I'd want to do that. I didn't know I had an opportunity in space. So that's one. And second one is working with the higher level education institutions. I'd like to see more effort and emphasis put on them, particularly in preparing them for the jobs of the future. And so as I alluded to, the Space Partnership Program that Space Force does is a great example of that. Being able to have our efforts into the institutions that are preparing our future workforce to go right into our jobs right after that. Right now, it's just kind of like shooting in the dark, I feel sometimes. They're giving, generic course lessons, but I think there's opportunity to provide them internships, projects to be able to push them that way. And I think the third one, and it's maybe less on the government, and more so on the industry, which is by far the largest employer of space entities, is what's a better way to employ them? How do you bring them in the first place? You know, is it still the same high bar, or is there an opportunity to be able to kind of grow them over, you know, maybe even through college into your career field there? So I'd like to see an emphasis on all those three areas, but I don't think any one of those can be done. I don't think you can do them all uniformly. They have to be focused separately.
I thought your comments on the importance of the Space Force to consider itself as part of the Joint Force were really spot on. You know, if we ever, the warfighting ethos piece and warfighting in space is really just warfighting in all domains. And so it's easy, it would be easy for us, and the risk is that we get very inwardly focused on Space Force and Guardians and on orbit activities and lose sight of, you know, we succeed or fail really based on what happens in land, air, and sea. And we contribute our capabilities. The reason we have things in space in almost every instance is to support land, air, and sea. And so I think the importance of staying connected, not just, I mean, those are all DoD examples, but then, you know, those next rings out with our partners in other countries who have fielded space capabilities that we rely on, that we want to tie closer to. And then, of course, with industry and academia, we move forward together, just as you describe, and the Space Force is just one of the actors there, that connection. But the warfighting piece really ties back to the importance of space to the success of the Joint Force, and we can't lose sight of that.
So kind of on that note, how do you know when you're getting it right or even right-ish? How will you measure it? And then how are you going to help that Space Force ethos make its way through, near and dear to my heart, because how do we get it into the acquisition community as well? And kind of how do you kind of get that message out there more broadly through the rest of your community?
Yeah, you know, in part, I'll look to others to tell us how we're doing. You know, National Space Council for sure. But you know, there are some metrics, and we think a lot about how are we getting it right to develop the product and training and education that we need for the Space Force. I think the much harder question is how are we getting it right as part of the Joint Force, and what does that look like in representation across the Department of Defense? And then how do we get it right in the broader community? I run into people all the time who still, you know, are you kidding me? There's really a Space Force. You know, they like the realization across America isn't there. And there's big chunks of the country where there's no Space Force presence. There's no installation. There's no mission. And so how do we think about that as a very small force within the great big DoD is something we got to think about. And what are the important metrics to measure? We can measure pretty clearly, you know, the meet mission kind of things, the readiness of the force on the military side. But I don't think we have a solution yet on how we think about what does success look like as part of the broader space ecosystem. And sir, I'm sure you got thoughts on that.
I do. You know, policy is really important. Strategy is really important. But part of it is what are the resources that you're putting into this? What are the programs that you're putting into these things? So I'm not sure if I have like a quantifiable number, like I'm looking for X, Y, or Z, but I think we're evolving out of the admiring the problem phase and actually now starting to put together programs and projects that actually say this is what we need to do. You know, as we're looking at the investments, we're looking at the budgets. You know, sometimes we'll point and say, you said this, show me where in the spreadsheet you're doing that, right? And being able to look at it that way is one way, but I also think that sometimes I may use a sports analogy here, it's a full court press. I mean, you're such a new service right now. This is where I believe the true opportunity exists, is to break the mold and try something different. You know, it might not be something that the Air Force did when you grew up in the Air Force. It might not be something that the Army or Navy does. It might just be something new because the environment, the ecosystem is different. And so how do you measure something like that? You just can't right now because you have no metric to show what that would look like. But if you don't take that first step into that world, it's kind of hard. So I don't think we're going to heavily judge on initiatives, but I think not seeing initiative is probably the bigger element which would raise our eyebrows.
So I think it's kind of a good news story that you say you have no shortage of people that want to be in the Space Force. So what is the most challenging aspect of identifying and recruiting the right people to be guardians in the service?
Yeah, I think and we talked about, I was talking to a little group up here ahead of time, but we really, we recruit individuals, and in many cases, we train and educate as individuals, but we never operate as individuals. You're always part of a crew, a team, a group. And so I think the evolution that we're working towards in training, where traditionally, certainly in the Air Force, but I think probably in the other services, just because of their scale, they have to train intelligence professionals and cyber professionals and space, well, in our case, space professionals. I think we have an opportunity to put them all together and to really train teams of people. And so then how do you recruit? What does that look like all the way back at recruiting on, I'm recruiting to fill a vacancy in a team. Here's what the team, the skills, the personality aspects, psychological assessment, all these things that because we're so small, we may have the opportunity to incorporate some of that stuff, just due to the scale that will let us, and think about that in bringing the right person in, not necessarily just the highest test scores, but maybe a little bit more than that fills the need that the team needs.
So then I'm kind of elevating again to pivot back to this larger strategic need. So is there a plan to try to better communicate or educate the average U.S. citizen on the criticality of space to our not just national security, but just overall way of life?
Yeah, I think that's what we're trying to do with our Space Council meetings writ large, is talk about what's the value of space. I mean, look, you have such dramatic moments such as the DART impact and soon to be Artemis launch, and that's going to capture the nation's attention, and we should not lose the opportunity to take advantage of that. And I don't mean that just from a civil space perspective. I mean it from across all space sectors perspective, right? Or the fact that I didn't see you on the video there, but I did saw Lieutenant General Shaw just meandering around the DART facility there and talking to people, and that's fantastic. I think we have an opportunity to really highlight the importance of that, just from those types of big moments along the way. But similarly, what we're also trying to do is partner with other education institutions, other communications, media, to say, here's what space is doing. One of the announcements that we made back in September is code.org is going to be, pushing we asked them and we worked with them to focus on space, right? We've asked some educational channels to focus some capabilities on space as well. So I think we really have, I think it's in all of our best interest to talk about it as routinely and as passionately as possible. But I don't think you talk about it, one last thing, on just space for space. It's space for, this is what the Vice President said at the last council meeting. It's jobs. It's economic opportunity and maybe sectors of the nation that might not have known that they could participate in a part of the supply chain for space. It's about strategic competition, as we all know. It's about international cooperation and partnerships. It's about STEM. It's about diversity and inclusiveness. Like, there's so many different elements that space can be a touch point for, but it doesn't have to just be space for space.
And how do you see either industry or academia being able to help inform you from the broad space perspective and then you from the Space Force perspective? How can we help inform you of trends we're seeing or needs that we have?
Oh, I just had this conversation yesterday, if I may just jump in. I mean, yes, how? The answer is yes. I think this is one of these things where we recognize, and that's why we partnered with over a dozen different companies on the skilled technical workforce. Turns out every company needs a skilled technical workforce, particularly the ones in the launch industry, but others as well. And each one of them are doing it inherently in a silo. And so we started listening at different conference and symposium meetings and industry association meetings, like, why don't we work together? And so I think to answer your question, Mandy, if you all feel you have a common need, please collect that information, maybe provide a little bit of data and background and provide it to us. And preferably if you have some addressable solutions as well, that would be helpful. So.
Absolutely. I think you had a question? Go for it. Thank you.
Sorry. My name is AJ Kotari. You mentioned, Chirag, about the number of STEM people students in this country as opposed to China, let's say, and we are obviously much smaller. There is nothing that is going to excite people more. Nothing excites people more than what you said about, like DART students, young students, between 3 and 7th grade also, including old students, But those kinds of things are really going to excite people. Artemis, and its 40-day journey, and afterwards, is going to excite people, students, a lot. And so along those lines, I would say that Space Force is sending something on Falcon Heavy on, I think, October 26 or 28 or something like that. That can also be, really pushed up publicly, And so that can excite people also. We can continue the excitement for the students and for other people, and that would be good. What do you think?
I think you're right, and there's been a host of them, right? Webb telescope, manned spaceflight returning to the United States. Any Falcon Heavy with the booster flyback, those images are incredible. And then certainly most recently DART, and they get a lot of national coverage. They get a lot of media attention. It excites, the student body and potential employees to come to the workforce, whether it's for the Space Force or for industry. I think there is an increased, generation of interest and excitement that's happening because of these really significant major milestones, like you point out.
But I would say that the environment has changed because I do expect, as I said, and as you said, that there will be a significant focus and attention on space. The question is what's the sustained focus and attention on space? Because in this day and age, attention spans are slightly less, and there's more opportunity to focus on things, from being on YouTube to the tech sector writ large, right? Like there's just so many more areas where people can take their skills and talents or dreams as well. And so I think that's why it's important that this is not a NASA issue, a Space Force issue, an IC issue, a NOAA issue. Like it needs to be kind of a horizontal theme. And how do you map that so people continuously hear and see space, on every launch, if possible?
We are never going to be but that's okay.
Oh,
Maybe.
we could try. Yeah. I think we'll have a question in the back and then take your question up here.
Hi, good afternoon. I was fortunate to be at an International Astronautical Congress in Paris a couple of weeks ago, and there's some impressive things going on around the world related to defense technologies out of places like Singapore, Poland, India. So, given the obvious limitations that the national security community has through forums like ITAR and struggles to do acquisition globally, but what are some potential opportunities for international engagement related to the workforce question? How can the Space Force be international? Is it forums like the Shriver War Games or other associations or partnerships that matter? What is your context on that?
Yeah, I'll speak just to the DoD side and then sort of more broadly maybe from you. But so certainly Shriver War Games, I mean, we are working hard on international outreach, but it's primarily within defense, right? And so international outreach, there are absolutely instances where we're going to international commercial entities for services. But primarily, exercises and war games and those things, we invite the defense communities with our allies that come in. So I think that's critically important, and that is our role in the Space Force. But that's just one piece of that engagement puzzle that kind of you're pointing out is there has to be engagement beyond just the Department of Defense.
And there is. I think later this year or early next year, India and the United States will be jointly launching a synthetic aperture radar satellite called NISAR, which will be focused on a lot of climate change and climate-related purposes. When I was in Paris as well and learned that, there's a company in Paris that builds a payload that integrates it on a bus in the United States, launches it out of the United States, and then it's used for our national security purposes. So I think, we can focus on the ITAR, the ever-present ITAR issue, but I think part of the creative calculus now is like, there's so many different factors that can be incorporated into a broader ecosystem. And I'm glad you talked about services and data. I know that there's part of the Artemis program, some of the manufacturing of some of the equipment is actually done overseas as well. So I think there's just different ways of thinking about it than just the traditional sale of technology.
one follow-up question, if I might. Do you see scope for programs that have been successful here in the U.S. for engaging smaller companies like Defense Innovation Unit, AFWorks, SpaceWorks, Spark? Do you see potential for being able to take that global to complement more agency-to-agency partnerships?
I'm looking at you. I think the answer is, well, I mean, look, I mean, maybe that's better asked at a follow-on panel here, but from my background, I would say that seems like a reasonable thing. But I think, what should also be noted is that other countries recognize what the United States is doing in the new space, so to speak, effort. And they're trying to recreate that within their own capacities right now. And I know Europe is particularly focused on that, Japan, Australia, they're trying to develop their space industries. So I think conceptually, I think that's a good idea. Practically speaking right now, I think we have so many industries out there that are a little bit further along that if that type of capability comes to coalition within other countries, then I think that's a reasonable area to look at.
Thank you.
Do you want to add anything to that one?
Yeah, what was going through my head was, will industry lead us there, or will government lead in that area? And I don't know the answer. Probably everyone has a thought on that, but it might be an area where industry leads government rather than the other way around.
And do you have a microphone up here?
Only if you can pronounce his full name.
I see Steve. Yeah.
Hey, Steve Jordan Tomaszewski with the Aerospace Industries Association. So my question is, what are you currently doing to improve training and professional development for space intelligence professionals in the Department of Defense and intelligence community?
Nothing right now for me.
I'll talk a little about what we're doing in the Space Force. And so, we're still very dependent on the Air Force for intelligence training, for sure. Space Force now is detachment down at the training location in Texas. We're working hard on that integration piece. And so what I see just looking across the training enterprise is we're still stovepiping our operators, and they don't ever work together until they show up at their first operational assignment. And we have to fix that. And so we're moving towards more integration, both shared classroom, but also integration events, sort of exercise capstone sort of events before they arrive in their first location. So that's early in their career, and then repetitive throughout. So we bring the communities together. True for the cyber community as well, working to get them together. And then we're working hard to increase the space curriculum, of course, in the Intel training pipeline. And so right now, really, they graduate. There is some space curriculum, but we're really graduating Air Force Intel officers and NCOs, and then Ken Klock picks them up and does top-off training for space. I think we're going to re-wicker that here. We just need a little bit more time to get all the pieces in place.
I was being facetious. I'll tell you what. This is my bread and butter. He's throwing me a softball here, really. So, one of the great things that got far less publicity than it should have. The newest intelligence organization within the Space Force is the National Space Intelligence Center. That's a scientific and technical intelligence center located at Wright-Patt Air Force Base in Ohio, reverse engineering the threats of today and tomorrow. The reason that center is important is not truly about the threat right this very second. It's really about being able to provide the awareness of the threats of the future, so then our future warfighters and our future acquisition professionals know what to be able to expect, know what to be able to develop, acquire, and if necessary, partner with commercial and international entities as well. Secondly, going to my NGA background, there are specialized disciplines in the intelligence community that don't often fall within the Space Force bucket. You have GeoInt, you have geospatial intelligence, you have signals intelligence, you have human intelligence, open source intelligence, and MASIN, measurements and signatures intelligence capabilities. These are hard technical disciplines that have different intelligence agencies that need to band together to work together on that. And then third, the operational intelligence. And I think that's really where you're pushing towards, sir, is how do you provide all of this technical intelligence, all of this indications and warning intelligence, so then an operator on the floor can say, hey, this is a training exercise versus this is an actual real life event versus this is a nothing burger to begin with. All of these things need to work in unison. They have to work in harmony, and part of that is being sure that we develop that cadre as well. So thank you for bringing that up.
Kind of hit on this a little bit, but what does training look like over the next decade?
I'll tell you that there's a lot to say there, but I'll talk about just one piece. We're really working hard on the live versus simulation, and how do we value, how am I able to measure the value of one versus the other? And this is really what we went down and talked to NASA about, because they do so much in the simulation space, but they've invested tremendously in that training capability there, so that when an astronaut, when they're docking with the ISS for the first time, it's just like it was in the simulator that they did 100 times. We traditionally have done almost everything really in a classroom environment or through simulation, and we don't have great simulation capability right now. I think there's room. When I look at like the Air Force Academy, the students there are flying a spacecraft every day. Falcon Sat, they build it. The engineering department builds it and they launch it, and it's not expensive. And they've got their whole ground structure through commercial that they're able to command. I'd love to get early in our training some kind of real life experience under their belt, some sorties, if you will, so that the burden of that training is not on the operations command and units. And so we're talking about moving things a little bit left in training, a little bit more live, but I don't yet know how to measure the value. My kind of gut instinct is a little bit more live is better, but I don't have the data to prove that, and we're trying to figure out what are the metrics to determine, live training versus simulated training, what's better. And then, there are things we will absolutely continue to do in the simulated environment through, because whether we're trying to, it's too complex to do on orbit, or for policy reasons, or for security reasons, we need to keep that in the simulated environment, and we'll keep those things in there.
And another question that came for you, General Bratton, what's your process, or how have you gone about kind of soliciting feedback through the service in terms of what's working, what needs to change, or what needs to stop as you're trying to kind of address these changes and as you're growing? Yeah,
Guardians are very vocal, and we promised a lot, and we have to deliver on these things. And so we use the traditional mechanisms. Chief and I are out. We have leadership engagements. We were out at basic training, talking to the newest Guardians in the force, just weeks into their training. And the questions are, how are you going to retain me when my first enlistment's up? And, I went through basic training. I was too scared to talk to anyone that came in. And I was just like, how do I get through my day today? And these Guardians are thinking 4 years ahead. Am I going to stay in the force? What are you going to do to keep me here? Maybe I'll go to industry and come, join you. So we're out there talking to them. They're very active on social media. Our community is. That's probably true everywhere. And we're trying. You gotta take that in appropriately, I think. And so, and we're so small that it's kind of easy to get. Hey, we're going to shoot out a survey and talk to everybody. So we get a lot of feedback. We're still, especially in STARCOM, everything is so new. There's not enough data yet to measure, to determine, do we need to make a change? Are we on track? We're still sort of in the implementation and data gathering phase of the new things.
Okay, so I think any other audience? Oh, got a question here? And any other audience questions? One from Dan Brophy next. And then we'll wrap it up. Awesome. Please.
Hi, Jaden Sage. I represent Celestial Ventures. We invest in space startups. And the question I have for both of you is this. Until and when space goes from the head to the heart, we will always struggle with recruitment. So while the engagement with university students is valuable, but it represents a pivot of the mind for that individual. How deep is the resonance, or how deep is the engagement to the elementary students? Because when you plant the seed at an early age, it goes directly to the heart and then controls the mind. Because the way we have it right now, it's a trickle-down effect. And because of it, you're only getting the engagement of the pivoting of the mind of individuals. And we need it to go to the heart, because those people, you can't stop them. But you can get somebody in space who pivoted from university into space to pivot back out?
Yeah, I mean, I completely resonate with that, and I think that's what I talked about a little bit earlier about the need to be able to inspire. Inspiring happens at that K through 12 level, and often inspiration comes in the most, non-traditional of forms. I mean, for me, it was watching a space shuttle launch on TV in elementary school. Other people, they've actually been to a launch. Other people have been to space camp. There's no one size fits all. It's being able to provide that opportunity of access, knowledge, the visual, to be able to do that along the way. One of the things where we have pivoted some of our efforts now is historically NASA has focused, in this case, on universities, right, for research, for recruitment, for internships. Now NASA's OSTEM office also focuses on K through 12 as well. And, the day and age may come where Space Force will be more synonymous in the public narrative like NASA is. But for the time being, when you think about a space career, you think about an astronaut. You think about a space organization, you think about NASA. So from a national perspective, NASA continues to be a great instrument to be able to inspire that next generation of workforce. And I think particularly to the Space Force's perspective, there may be lessons learned about what NASA's doing that we might be able to inculcate into the Space Force culture as well, not just in the university partnership element, but also maybe even to the K through 12.
Yeah, I think exactly right. And similar to the answer to your question, I mean, there's amazing things happening right now that are very visible that would have inspired me when I was young. I grew up with the shuttle era, and I watched all those launches and remember exactly where I was for Challenger and Columbia as those events unfolded. I think today's, a kid in school today is seeing DART and seeing Webb telescope images and seeing return, human spaceflight launching from the United States. I mean, these are inspiring things. Rockets flying back and landing. How can you not be inspired? Our responsibility is to continue to get that out there and make it visible and try and NASA's great at that, at getting those things into the classroom as best they can. We certainly want to be supporting in those efforts.
I just noticed something interesting. We're talking about how we were inspired by the shuttle generation. A generation ago, there was the inspiration by the Apollo generation. And the real question to you all, and I don't think there is a single answer anymore, what is this generation's inspiration of space? Like, you have some of the moments that you've talked about, but, is it the space industry now, right? Is it the entrepreneurship of space? Is it the Space Force at this point? Like, I think it's an open-ended question at this point. Nobody can just focus on one anymore.
I'm sorry, I do have a follow-up, but I'm going to respectfully disagree. The challenge is it's a mental state for everybody in the space industry to feel that how they feel is how everybody else feels. The public writ large may be interested in space as a moment to capture their attention, the attention deficit disorder. But simultaneously, to dedicate their life to the engagement of space, they just have too many other narratives that they can follow. I mean, NASA gets respect because it was born in a different time. Now, when Space Force was born, it got a show on TV that was actually, now Space Force has to pivot its perception from get-go, while NASA from get-go was highly respected. So the narrative for the people in the space industry think that why everybody's thinking of it. They're not. They're just doing the attention engagement. But they're not going to dedicate their life. And for us to go into space the way we really want to, a space ecosphere, will requisite that we actually have a far deeper and far larger public engagement, not just the small side.
Mm-hmm. Not sure we're in a disagreement here. I agree with you. Yeah.
The only thing I'm saying is that the engagement has to be for the public at large, not a subset.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I know we're going a little bit over time, but we're kind of jammed. We'll do two questions. So Dan Brophy, and then I have a fun rapid fire.
Yeah, Dan Brophy, York Space Systems. So we've been talking about this global war for highly skilled labor. And in a complete reversal from the past, the commercial market is now spending so much on R&D. The tech titans alone are spending over $100 billion a year, and you recently came from one, Chirag. So, given that that's where the money's going, how do you compete with that, for the best minds and the best talent, given that the money sort of moved from R&D being or the government being the nucleus of R&D to now private commercial companies are driving most of the R&D. I'd love to hear your perspective since you just recently came from the commercial side back over to the government side.
Well, I think I'd first question it is obvious that there is a significant commercial investment from the billionaires to the investors as well, right? And that's not insignificant, and that's getting a lot of notice, it's getting a lot of attention, it's getting a lot of innovation as well. But just last year, we plussed up the Space Force's budget by 30%. Right, and we're talking tens of billions of dollars. I think it's like something like 20, don't quote me, like 25, $26 billion for Space Force. We upped NASA's budget by 8%, and that's in the mid $20 billion range. Obviously, the IC investment is different, which we can't talk about here, but that's a significant investment. The vast majority of that investment goes to into the industry, whether we're talking the defense industrial base or so I think, I think when it comes to talent, that is a challenge, and that's something that we need to address. I said this maybe a month ago or something, like the most valuable thing, one of the things that brings you into government and maybe some folks back into government is the opportunity to be at the table, the opportunity to be able to make a decision that's bigger than yourself, that's bigger than the bottom line sometimes. And back to pull on the hearts and minds type of perspective, like that's a drawing, that's a calling.
Were they getting questions from the crowd?
Not for everybody, but for some people. Anyhow, so but it's a challenging situation from a workforce perspective, but it doesn't mean it's binary either, right? So I'm sorry, and it's not a direct answer to your question there, but I also do believe that the government is investing heavily into space, and I do believe that if you look at it, there's a derivative benefit into the industry, and also not just derivative benefit to like the actual space companies, but it's all your supplier bases too, right? And that's not tracked very well, but I do believe that we provide a significant value still.
Yeah, I think I'd only add real quick, we went through this a little bit with cyber, and I had a cyber ops group, and it was how do we keep them in government service? There's so much opportunity on the commercial side, but they also want to stay. You can do things in government that sometimes you can't do in other spaces, and so there is a portion that just wants to stay to do those very difficult things that NASA does, or to be involved in the military aspect that the Space Force does. I think eventually we'll figure out, we're working hard on the reserve component. What's that look like for the Space Force? We'll get that across the finish line, and that'll provide, really the best of both worlds for some, where they can stay in government service as a part-time member, and then, work in industry as well.
Okay, so I know we went over time. Thank you all. We'll still end on time, don't worry. Rapid fire, get off the stage question. In your roles, what have you been most surprised by, and what have you been most inspired by?
What's the first one?
Surprised.
I think it's this if we're talking about workforce related issues here, I think it's the skilled technical workforce. I think many of us, myself included, grew up thinking about space in the STEM parlance, and now understanding maybe from a military perspective, you often think about generals, right? And we got the chiefs back there in the back row over there, but it's the enlisted cadre often that is what makes the machine run, and it's by far. I got a fist bump out of that. That's good. So, but it's by far like the vast number of military personnel, right? And it's the same thing with the skilled technical workforce. I'm surprised at just how little attention and appreciation is brought to them, and how incredibly critical they are to our sector.
Yeah, the most surprised by is how fast we're moving, and for a government organization, things are happening far quicker than I thought they would be. Being in a command that's only a year old, and there's so much to do. It feels like we haven't gotten anything done, and then I look back and a year ago there was about 10 of us, and we're moving pretty quick. And now we're generating Guardians at basic training with Guardian MTIs in a Guardian ecosystem with space curriculum. That's really fast for us, but absolutely industry would probably be moving faster. But I was surprised by how much we were able to get done, inspired by these young Guardians coming in, and they're joining their organizations as well. They're ready to go even faster, and they're excited about what we're doing. They're excited about the space industry and being part of this sort of revolution that's happening now. And so just being around them is fantastic.
And I can't thank you both enough for joining today and taking the time to talk about this. So we'll turn it over to the next panel. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah.